14 ancient sites in Australia that history can't explain. There is a place in the southern hemisphere where the oldest continuous civilization on Earth left behind things that mainstream archaeology still cannot fully explain. Not rumors, not campfire stories. Actual physical structures, carved markings, and buried evidence that does not fit the accepted timeline. Australia has been quietly sitting on some of the most confounding ancient mysteries in the world, and most people have never heard of any of them. You have probably been told that Australian prehistory is straightforward. Ancient peoples arrived somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago, lived in harmony with the land, and left behind rock art and stone tools. That is partly true, but it leaves out the sites that researchers struggle to categorize. It leaves out the formations that appear far too precise to be natural. It leaves out the engravings that match symbols found on the other side of the world. It leaves out the ruins that should not exist by any conventional understanding of who was here and when. We are not talking about fringe theories with no basis in evidence. We are talking about documented locations that have been surveyed, photographed, and studied by geologists, archaeologists, and independent researchers, some of whom have walked away with more questions than answers. 14 of those locations are what we are going to work through today. Before we get into it, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. There is a lot more coming in this series, and some of it is going to challenge things you thought you already knew. Let us start at the top. The first site is in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, and it is called the Murujuga Rock Art Complex, better known as the Burrup Peninsula engravings. This is not a small collection of carvings on a single cliff face. It is the largest concentration of ancient rock art on Earth, with estimates ranging from 1 million to over 2 million individual engravings spread across a rocky landscape that stretches for kilometers. The engravings depict animals that went extinct thousands of years ago, including the thylacine, now commonly called the Tasmanian tiger, which disappeared from the Australian mainland somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 years ago under current estimates. But some of the Burrup engravings show fauna that have been argued to represent animals extinct for much longer periods, possibly tens of thousands of years, which would push the creation date of at least some of these images into a time frame that makes conventional researchers deeply uncomfortable. What nobody has been able to explain is the sheer scale of organization implied by this complex. 1 million carvings across one site is not casual artistic expression. It suggests a sustained, intentional effort by a community with a clear purpose across generations. What that purpose was and who coordinated it remains genuinely unknown. The second site sits in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, and it has been generating controversy since the early 1980s. Inside a sandstone cave in the Gosford region, a set of hieroglyphic inscriptions was found carved into the walls. They were Egyptian hieroglyphics, not inspired by, not vaguely similar to, actual ancient Egyptian script. Two Egyptologists who examined photographs of the carvings in the 1980s, Ray Johnson and Mohammed Ibrahim, produced a translation, arguing the inscriptions described an expedition to a strange southern land, led by a royal figure, possibly a son of Pharaoh Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid. The Egyptian establishment dismissed this. So did most Australian archaeologists. They called the carvings a hoax, a colonial-era fake. But the problem is that the erosion pattern on the carvings is consistent with extreme age. Later analysis suggested the weathering was not consistent with engravings made in the last 200 years. No one has been able to prove who carved them, when, or why a colonial hoaxer would go to the effort of producing accurate ancient Egyptian text in a remote bush location that was not easily accessible. The Gosford glyphs remain unexplained, not confirmed, and not convincingly debunked. The third site is Gympie, in Queensland. In the 1960s, a local farmer named Dal Berry was ploughing his property near the town of Gympie and struck something beneath the soil. What he eventually uncovered was a large stone pyramid structure, built in terrace steps, constructed from local sandstone blocks. The pyramid was partially demolished in subsequent years as the land was developed, but photographs from the period show a clearly constructed, tiered stone structure that bore no resemblance to any natural geological formation. Aboriginal oral tradition in the region refers to the structure and attributes its construction to a people who came before. Local historians have noted that early European settlers in the area recorded stories about the structure from Aboriginal informants who described it as ancient, predating the oldest memory of their own people. The Queensland government has never formally excavated the site. What remains has largely been covered over. The Gympie pyramid is one of the least examined potential ancient structures in the country, which itself raises questions about why it has received so little official attention. A local historian named Elaine Kennedy spent years compiling records from early European settlers who described the structure in their journals. Several of those journals described the pyramid as already heavily weathered and partially covered in vegetation when the earliest settlers arrived in the mid-1800s, suggesting it was not a recent construction even then. Kennedy's research was largely ignored by the academic establishment. The files she compiled are held in a private collection. The fourth site takes us back to Western Australia, to a location in the Midwest region near the town of Mullewa. The Wurdi stone arrangement in Victoria is actually the fifth site on our list, so let us deal with Mullewa first. Near this region, researchers have documented a series of large stone circles and alignments that have been argued to function as astronomical markers. These are not loose collections of stones. They are deliberate arrangements showing consistent spacing and orientation toward astronomical events, including solstice and equinox, sunrise and sunset positions. The precision of these alignments has led some researchers to argue that the people who built them had a sophisticated working knowledge of celestial mechanics that goes well beyond what is usually attributed to pre-contact Australian cultures. That brings us to Wurdi itself, the fifth site, which sits near the town of Little River in Victoria. This is an egg-shaped stone arrangement of roughly 90 standing stones, created by the Wathaurong Aboriginal people. What makes it remarkable is that when researchers from the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation analysed it in the mid-2000s, they found that it aligns with the setting positions of the sun at the summer solstice, winter solstice, and equinoxes with significant precision. The discovery led to one of the most important quiet revisions in Australian academic history. The site has been tentatively dated to somewhere between 11,000 and 22,000 years before present. If the upper end of that estimate is correct, it would make Youang the oldest astronomical observatory ever identified, predating Stonehenge by over 10,000 years. The research team that published these findings was not a group of fringe theorists. They were credentialed scientists from one of Australia's most respected research institutions. The mainstream academic response was cautious interest, not dismissal. But the full implications have never been fully incorporated into the broader understanding of ancient Australian civilization. The sixth site is in the Northern Territory, in the region around Arnhem Land. Deep in the sandstone escarpment country, researchers and Aboriginal custodians have documented what are known as Wanjina figures. Massive painted human-like forms with large round heads, enormous eyes, and no mouths, surrounded by what appears to be a halo or helmet-like structure. These figures appear across a large geographic range and are not limited to one cultural group. They recur in rock art across the Kimberley region, as well as Arnhem Land. The traditional custodians describe the Wanjina as sky beings who came from the clouds and the sea. Western Australian researcher and rock art specialist Graham Walsh spent decades documenting this art and argued that some of the oldest Wanjina-style figures could be 40 to 60,000 years old, though dating rock art reliably is among the hardest challenges in the field. What cannot be argued away is the consistency of the imagery across vast distances and the fact that these figures bear a striking resemblance to depictions in other ancient traditions from completely separate parts of the world, including Sumerian and pre-Columbian Mesoamerican art. The resemblance has never been explained. What makes the Wanjina figures even harder to categorize within conventional frameworks is the specificity of the image. These are not vague, humanoid outlines. They are carefully rendered figures with consistent proportions and consistent features repeated across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. The round head, with its pronounced outline, the large eyes without pupils, and the complete absence of a mouth appear site after site with a fidelity that implies either direct cultural communication between groups across enormous distances or a shared source that predates the geographic separation of those groups. Neither explanation sits comfortably inside the standard narrative. The seventh site is on the Cape York Peninsula in far north Queensland, where a set of stone ruins was documented in the late 20th century by a number of researchers, including amateur archaeologist Rex Gilroy, who has been controversial, but who was among the first to systematically document unusual stone formations across the Australian continent. On Cape York, the structures in question include stone walls, stone circles, and arrangements of stone blocks that form clear geometric patterns inconsistent with natural geological processes. Local Aboriginal tradition speaks of a time before the current people, a time when other beings lived in the north. Some researchers have attempted to connect these structures to Papuan or Southeast Asian contact in the ancient period. Others argue the formations are the work of early Australian populations, whose construction capabilities have been drastically underestimated by the archaeological mainstream. No formal excavation program has been established. The eighth site is in South Australia, in the Flinders Ranges, where local researchers have documented what appear to be ancient stone walls and foundations partially buried in the landscape. Some of these formations show clear evidence of deliberate construction, including the selection and placement of specific stone types, the use of what appears to be a binding compound in some sections, and consistent orientation that suggests architectural planning. The Flinders Ranges have been the site of significant paleontological work, most famously for the Ediacaran fauna fossils that gave their name to an entire geological period. But the stone formations have attracted little of the same institutional attention. Local amateur researchers, who have attempted to draw government archaeological interest, have largely been told the formations are natural. Independent geologists who have visited the sites have not always agreed. One geologist who examined a section of the walling in the 1990s wrote in a private report that the stone selection was inconsistent with natural deposition and showed evidence of deliberate transport from a source location several kilometres distant. That report was never formally published. The researcher declined to attach their name to a public claim that would have been career-limiting in the Australian academic environment at the time. The Flinders Ranges site is an example of a broader pattern across Australia, where the barrier to investigation is not the absence of evidence, but the professional risk that comes with taking the evidence seriously. The ninth site is in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales, where a large carved rock platform called Elvina Track contains engravings that include geometric forms, animal figures, and humanoid shapes. What distinguishes this site from a straightforward rock art location is the presence among the conventional carvings of figures that bear an unusual resemblance to Egyptian depictions of deities, including one carving that multiple independent observers have compared to the god Anubis. This is not a claim made by one person. Multiple visitors to the site over the years have noted the same thing independently. Whether this represents a genuine anomaly, a misidentification, or something else is genuinely unclear. But it sits in a region of New South Wales that also contains the Gosford glyphs, and the proximity of two independently anomalous sites has not gone unnoticed. The 10th site is Kariong, also in New South Wales, which is sometimes referred to as the Egyptian hieroglyphic cave. We touched on this when discussing Gosford, because Gosford and Kariong are sometimes used interchangeably in the popular literature, but they refer to the same physical site. What is worth noting as a separate point here is the discovery in the same area of what has been called a cartouche, a formal Egyptian oval inscription frame carved into the rock alongside the hieroglyphs. A cartouche in Egyptian tradition was used specifically to enclose the name of a royal figure. Finding one in Australian sandstone, accurately rendered, whether by ancient contact or by a colonial-era forger with unusually specialised knowledge, is extraordinary in either scenario. The 11th site is on Kangaroo Island off the coast of South Australia, where a series of stone arrangements and what appear to be ancient stone circles have been documented in the interior of the island. Kangaroo Island is unusual in Australian prehistory because it was inhabited in the ancient past and then abandoned. Evidence of habitation has been dated to over 10,000 years before present, but the island appears to have been empty of human occupation when European settlers arrived. Why an inhabited island was abandoned and when exactly that abandonment occurred has not been resolved. The stone formations on the island predate the most recent period of habitation. Some researchers have suggested they represent an even earlier occupation layer, one that predates the people who were there 10,000 years ago. The stone circles on Kangaroo Island have not been formally dated. No excavation program has targeted them. The island does appear in Aboriginal oral tradition from mainland South Australia as a place of significance associated with ancient events but the details of those traditions are held by community custodians and have not been shared in any public record. What can be said is that the island's pattern of occupation and abandonment is itself unusual by any global standard. Populated islands do not simply empty without reason. Disease, resource collapse, or conflict are the usual explanations. None of those explanations has been confirmed for Kangaroo Island. The island stood empty for reasons that remain unknown, and the stone formations it contains were already old when the most recent inhabitants arrived. The 12th site is in Tasmania, specifically in the remote southwest wilderness, where stone arrangements have been documented in areas that are extremely difficult to access and were considered uninhabitable for most of the 20th century. The Aboriginal people of Tasmania were cut off from the Australian mainland when sea levels rose after the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, and developed in isolation for a very long time. Researchers who have worked in the southwest have found evidence of habitation going back over 30,000 years in some cave systems. But the stone arrangements in the open landscape suggest a different activity, not shelter seeking but deliberate marking of the terrain. What those markings mean and who made them has not been established. What adds another layer to the Tasmania question is the genetic evidence. Modern Tasmanians are descended from people who were isolated from the mainland for 12,000 years. But analysis of the archaeological record in some southwest cave systems has suggested that the earliest occupation may have involved more than one population, with some evidence for a transition between groups rather than a simple, unbroken lineage. If more than one group occupied Tasmania at different points in the ancient past, the open country stone arrangements may not belong to the same culture as the cave occupation sites. The southwest of Tasmania is wild enough that large areas of it have never been fully surveyed on the ground. What may still be sitting undiscovered in that landscape is a question no one can currently answer. The 13th site returns us to Western Australia, to the Gympie region, where a specific location called Wanja Cave holds some of the most striking ancient imagery in the country. This is distinct from the broader Wanjina tradition discussed earlier because of a specific feature of the cave. Along with the large Wanjina figures, the cave contains smaller painted figures that have been described by multiple researchers as appearing to depict beings in some form of suit or protective covering, with rounded heads and joined limbs. The traditional custodians of this site do not encourage outside interpretation of the paintings and regard them as sacred. What can be said from a documented research perspective is that these particular figures stand out even within the Wanjina tradition for the precision and detail of their rendering and for the technical challenge they would have represented for anyone painting them on a cave ceiling without modern materials or lighting. The 14th site is Lark Quarry in Western Queensland, which is formally recognised and officially documented, but which earns its place on this list because of what it represents. Lark Quarry contains the only known evidence of a dinosaur stampede preserved in fossil form anywhere on Earth. Over 3,000 individual dinosaur footprints are preserved in the rock, recording a moment approximately 95 million years ago when a large theropod dinosaur drove a group of smaller animals into a panicked run. That fact alone is remarkable. But what makes it genuinely mysterious in a human context is that Aboriginal oral tradition in the region contains accounts of large reptilian beings from the distant past that have been passed down across thousands of generations. When researchers have discussed this tradition with community elders, the descriptions given have included behavioural characteristics that are consistent with theropod-type animals. Whether this represents a genuine multi-generational memory of living animals from a period before the dinosaur extinction, which conventional science says is impossible, or a separate phenomenon, is a question that has no settled answer. What paleontologists confirm is that the density of preserved trackways here has no parallel anywhere on Earth. The behavioural evidence in the stone, the sudden direction change, the compressed spacing between prints, the evident panic, tells a story 95 million years old that modern analysis can read plainly. What these 14 sites share is not a unified conspiracy or a single explanation. What they share is that each one, in its own way, does not fit neatly into the story that has most commonly been told about the ancient past of this continent. Some of them are definitively ancient. Some of them are disputed. Some of them have been quietly avoided by the institutions that would be expected to investigate them. And some of them are protected by traditional custodians who hold knowledge that has never been fully shared with outside researchers. Australia is the oldest continent on Earth, the driest inhabited landmass, and the home of the world's oldest continuous culture. The idea that it would contain evidence of things that our current frameworks cannot fully account for is not surprising if you think about it clearly. What is surprising is how little most people know about any of this. There is a version of the past that you were taught, and there is a version of the past that the ground itself preserves. Sometimes those two things agree, and sometimes the ground tells a different story. In Australia, the ground has been telling a different story for a very long time, across 14 sites that have been documented, surveyed, questioned, and in some cases, quietly filed away. The story it tells is not yet complete, but it is clearly more complex than the version most people carry around. We are only beginning to learn how to listen.